The mahogany walls of Meridian Café seemed to close in as Victoria Steinberg's sharp words cut through the morning air like a blade. Her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a crystal coffee cup worth more than most people's monthly rent, while across the room a father quietly helped his young daughter with her coloring book. She had no idea he understood every venomous syllable she'd just spoken in German. No idea that her careless cruelty was about to unravel in the most unexpected way. What happened next would shake the very foundation of everything she believed about power, respect, and the true measure of a person's worth. Sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unlikely teachers, and sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous to underestimate. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Café, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. James Carter sat at a corner table, his weathered hands steady as he helped his 7-year-old daughter Sophie color within the lines of her princess coloring book. The cafe buzzed with the quiet conversations of Seattle's business elite, the soft clink of expensive china punctuating the air. James looked out of place here, his worn jeans and faded flannel shirt a stark contrast to the tailored suits and designer dresses surrounding him. But Sophie had insisted on this cafe after seeing the elaborate pastries in the window, and he couldn't deny her simple joy, even if it meant spending more on 2 hot chocolates than he usually spent on groceries for a day. Sophie's tongue peeked out in concentration as she carefully selected a purple crayon. "Daddy, do you think princesses really wear purple dresses?" she asked, her voice carrying the innocent wonder that made James's heart ache with love. He tucked a strand of her sandy brown hair behind her ear, marveling at how she could find magic in the simplest things, even after everything they'd been through. The past 2 years since Maria's death had been a constant balancing act of grief and responsibility, of trying to be both mother and father to a little girl who deserved the world. "I think princesses can wear whatever color makes them happy," James replied softly, his voice carrying just a hint of the exhaustion that seemed to cling to him these days. He glanced at his watch. They had 30 minutes before Sophie's violin lesson, just enough time for her to finish her masterpiece and enjoy her treat. The normalcy of this moment felt precious, a small island of peace in the ocean of challenges that defined their daily life. At a table near the window, Victoria Steinberg commanded attention without even trying. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, not a single strand daring to escape its perfectly sculpted prison. Her Hermès suit, the color of fresh blood, fit her like it had been painted on, and her shoes alone cost more than James made in a month. She spoke rapidly into her phone in English, her voice crisp with authority, as she discussed quarterly projections and market acquisitions. Victoria Steinberg didn't just participate in the business world, she dominated it, and everyone in her sphere knew it. She ended her call with a sharp tap of her manicured nail against the screen and surveyed the cafe with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to owning every room she entered. Her ice-blue eyes swept past James and Sophie dismissively, but something about their presence in her carefully curated world seemed to irritate her, like a smudge on an otherwise perfect painting. She reached for her coffee cup with movements so precise they seemed choreographed, every gesture designed to display her superiority over the common mortals sharing her airspace. Sophie's crayon slipped, creating a small purple line outside the princess's dress. "Oops," she whispered, her lower lip trembling slightly. James immediately moved to reassure her, his large hand covering her small one. "It's okay, sweetheart. Sometimes the best art happens when we color outside the lines," he said, his voice gentle and warm. Sophie's face brightened, and she giggled, the sound pure and musical in the sophisticated atmosphere of the cafe. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The sound of the child's laughter grated against her nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. She turned to her assistant, a nervous young woman named Charlotte, who seemed to shrink under Victoria's scrutiny. Without looking in James and Sophie's direction, Victoria began to speak in rapid, fluent German, her voice low but carrying clearly across the space between their tables. "Diese Leute gehören nicht hierher," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Look at them. The father in those pathetic clothes, letting his brat make noise in a place like this. They're probably spending their welfare money on overpriced coffee to feel important for 5 minutes. It's disgusting how some people have no sense of their place in society." Charlotte shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting nervously between Victoria and the father-daughter pair. She understood enough German to catch the meaning, and the cruelty in Victoria's words made her stomach turn. But speaking up to Victoria Steinberg was like volunteering to step in front of a firing squad, and Charlotte valued her career more than her conscience. James's hand stilled on Sophie's colouring book. Every muscle in his body went rigid as Victoria's words hit him like physical blows. He understood every single word, every nuance of her contempt, every layer of her prejudice. His jaw clenched as he fought the urge to respond immediately, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Sophie, oblivious to the verbal assault, continued colouring her princess, humming softly under her breath. The innocence of her joy made Victoria's cruelty even more painful, even more unforgivable. Victoria continued her tirade, emboldened by what she perceived as the safe anonymity of a foreign language. "I bet he doesn't even have a real job. Probably some deadbeat living off government assistance, teaching his child that mediocrity is acceptable. This is exactly what's wrong with America. No standards, no class consciousness. These people reproduce and drag down the quality of public spaces for the rest of us." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, and James felt something fundamental shift inside him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about his daughter, about every struggling parent who had ever been judged for their clothes or their circumstances. This was about the assumption that poverty meant worthlessness, that appearance determined value. This was about Maria's memory, and the promise he'd made to raise Sophie in a world where kindness mattered more than bank balances. James took a deep breath, his decision crystallizing with absolute clarity. He stood up slowly, his movement deliberate and controlled. Sophie looked up at him with curious eyes, sensing the change in his energy, but not understanding its source. "Stay here and keep colouring, baby girl," he said softly, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Daddy needs to have a grown-up conversation for a minute." Victoria was still speaking in German, unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. The worst part is how entitled they act, as if they belong in civilized society. Someone should tell them there are places more appropriate for their kind. McDonald's, perhaps, or some dreadful family restaurant where children can screech without disturbing their betters. James walked over to Victoria's table with measured steps, each footfall deliberate and purposeful. The cafe seemed to hold its breath as he approached, conversations dying away as patrons sensed the electricity in the air. He stopped directly in front of Victoria's table, his presence commanding despite his casual attire. When he spoke, his German was not just fluent, it was perfect, educated, with the precise pronunciation of someone who had learned the language not from textbooks, but from native speakers. "Entschuldigen Sie," James began, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes widening in shock as the impossible happened. This man, this nobody she had dismissed so completely, was speaking her language with the fluency of a diplomat. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. Perhaps you'd like to continue it in English, so everyone here can appreciate your charming opinions about welfare recipients and deadbeat fathers." The coffee cup slipped from Victoria's suddenly nerveless fingers, the expensive china shattering against the marble floor with a sound like thunder in the sudden silence. Every eye in the cafe turned toward their table, drawn by the electricity of the confrontation and the shocking realization that the quiet father in the corner had just demolished Victoria's assumptions with surgical precision. Charlotte's mouth fell open in horrified fascination, while other patrons leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Victoria's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: shock, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been fear. She had built her empire on the foundation of being the smartest person in every room, of having information and advantages that others lacked. Now, stripped of her linguistic hiding place, she found herself exposed and vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced in decades. Her perfectly composed facade began to crack, revealing the uncertainty beneath her armor of arrogance. I don't know what you think you heard," Victoria stammered, her usual commanding presence evaporating like smoke. She glanced around the cafe, suddenly aware that dozens of pairs of eyes were focused on their interaction, waiting to see how this drama would unfold. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that she felt dizzy with the displacement. James smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Oh, I heard quite clearly. You think I'm a welfare recipient, a deadbeat father corrupting this establishment with my presence and my child's laughter. You believe we don't belong in civilized society and should confine ourselves to McDonald's and dreadful family restaurants." He paused, letting the weight of her own words settle over the suddenly silent cafe like a heavy blanket. "Would you like me to continue translating? Or shall we move on to discussing why you felt comfortable making such assumptions about strangers?" The silence stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft scratch of Sophie's crayon against paper, as she continued coloring, blissfully unaware of the seismic shift occurring just steps away from her table. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her napkin, her composed exterior crumbling piece by piece. She had underestimated this man so completely, so catastrophically, that she wasn't sure how to begin rebuilding her shattered confidence. "Your German is impressive," Victoria managed to say, her voice hollow and strained. She was buying time, trying to regain her footing in a conversation that had spiraled completely beyond her control. "Where did you learn to speak it so well?" James's expression didn't soften. "My wife was from Munich. We met when I was studying computer science at Technical University there on a full scholarship. I learned German because I wanted to communicate with her family, to understand the culture that shaped the woman I loved." His voice caught almost imperceptibly on the word "was," but he pressed on. "She died 2 years ago, and now I'm raising our daughter alone while working as a senior software engineer at Microsoft. Not quite the deadbeat narrative you were constructing, is it?" The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow, each word stripping away another layer of her assumptions and prejudices. She had created an entire fiction about this man's life, based on nothing more than his appearance and his presence in what she considered her territory. The reality, that he was educated, accomplished, and dealing with profound loss while maintaining his dignity, made her casual cruelty seem even more monstrous. I'm sorry for your loss," Victoria whispered, the words feeling inadequate and hollow in her mouth. She looked toward Sophie, still contentedly coloring her princess, and felt something twist painfully in her chest. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know," James replied, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of controlled anger. "You didn't bother to know. You saw worn clothes and a single father, and immediately constructed an entire story about who we are and what we deserve. You spoke about us like we were objects rather than human beings, as if our presence somehow contaminated your perfect morning." Charlotte shifted uncomfortably in her chair, wishing she could disappear into the expensive upholstery. Other patrons in the cafe continued to watch with rapt attention, many of them pulling out their phones to capture what was clearly becoming a viral moment. Victoria noticed the recording devices and felt panic begin to claw at her throat. Her reputation, her carefully constructed image, was being dismantled in real time and broadcast to the world. "Please," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "I made a mistake. I was wrong to say those things. Can we Can we discuss this privately? James studied her face, noting the genuine distress that had replaced her earlier arrogance. Privacy is a luxury you didn't afford my daughter and me when you were discussing our worthiness to exist in public spaces. But I'm not interested in destroying you, Ms. Steinberg, she supplied automatically. Victoria Steinberg. Recognition flickered across James's features. Steinberg Tech Solutions? You're the CEO who's been pushing for more diversity in STEM education. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a woman who publicly advocated for inclusion while privately practicing the most exclusionary kind of prejudice. Victoria nodded miserably, realizing that her public persona made this situation even more damaging. She had built her brand on being a champion of the underdog, a successful woman who lifted others as she climbed. The contradiction between her public image and her private behavior was stark enough to end careers and destroy reputations. Let me ask you something, James continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made his words more cutting. When you advocate for diversity and inclusion in your board meetings and press conferences, do you picture people like me and my daughter? Or do you imagine diversity as something that happens safely in boardrooms and carefully managed corporate environments, never spilling over into your personal spaces? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing Victoria to confront the disconnect between her public advocacy and her private prejudices. She realized that she had compartmentalized her beliefs, supporting diversity as an abstract concept while recoiling from actual diverse people when they appeared in her carefully curated world. James glanced back at Sophie, who had finished her princess and was now starting on a new page featuring a castle. The sight of his daughter, so innocent and unaware of the adult complexities swirling around her, seemed to drain some of the anger from his posture. I don't need your apology, he said quietly. But maybe you should think about whether the inclusion you preach extends to single fathers who shop at Target instead of Nordstrom, to children whose laughter might disrupt your morning routine. Victoria followed his gaze to Sophie and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding. This wasn't just about her embarrassment or her public image. This was about a little girl who deserved to color princesses in peace without being the subject of cruel commentary. It was about a father who was doing his best in impossible circumstances while dealing with grief that Victoria couldn't even imagine. She's beautiful, Victoria said softly, her voice carrying none of its earlier sharp edges. Your daughter. She looks happy. James's expression softened slightly. She is happy. Despite everything we've been through, despite the challenges we face every day, she still finds joy in coloring books and hot chocolate. She still believes the world is fundamentally good. He paused, looking directly at Victoria. I'd like to keep it that way for as long as possible. The implication was clear. Victoria's casual cruelty was the kind of thing that slowly eroded a child's faith in human goodness. Victoria felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, heavier than any business deal or corporate decision she'd ever faced. She had the power to contribute to that erosion or to fight against it, and her choice in this moment would define more than just this interaction. I have a daughter too, Victoria said suddenly, the words emerging before she could stop them. Had. She would be about Sophie's age now. The admission came out broken, raw, stripped of all the protective armor Victoria usually wore. I lost her when she was 3. Car accident. The revelation hung between them, changing the entire dynamic of their conversation. James's anger dissolved into something more complex, understanding mixed with sadness, recognition of shared loss, transcending their earlier conflict. He had assumed Victoria was simply a privileged woman who had never faced real hardship, but grief was a language they both spoke fluently. I'm sorry, James said, and meant it. I can't imagine losing Sophie. The fear of something happening to her keeps me awake at night. Victoria nodded, tears threatening to spill from her carefully made-up eyes. Her name was Emma. She had curly hair like Sophie's, and she loved to draw. Princesses mostly. She looked toward Sophie again, and this time her expression held wonder rather than irritation. I don't usually let myself remember those things. It's easier to stay angry than to feel the sadness. The confession changed everything. James saw Victoria clearly for the first time, not as a villain or a symbol of privilege, but as another parent navigating loss in the only way she knew how. Her cruelty hadn't come from malice, but from pain, from the terrible human tendency to build walls around wounded hearts. Anger can be a shield, James said gently. After Maria died, I was furious at everyone. Couples walking hand in hand, families having dinner together, anyone whose life looked easier than mine. It felt safer than admitting how scared I was, how lost I felt trying to raise Sophie alone. Victoria wiped her eyes carefully, trying not to smudge her makeup. How do you do it? How do you keep going? Keep being the father she needs? James glanced at Sophie again, drawing strength from her steady presence. One day at a time. Some days 1 hour at a time. And I remember that she deserves a father who sees beauty in the world, even when it's hard to find. He paused, studying Victoria's face. Maybe Emma would want you to see that beauty too, instead of pushing it away when it gets too close. The suggestion hit Victoria like a revelation. She had spent years building walls around her heart, creating distance between herself and anything that reminded her of what she'd lost. Her success, her carefully controlled environment, her dismissal of anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards. It had all been a way to avoid feeling the crushing weight of Emma's absence. I've forgotten how to see it, Victoria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The beauty, I mean. It's been so long since I let myself feel anything other than answers or ambition. When I saw Sophie laughing, it hurt. It reminded me of what I lost, and I lashed out instead of letting myself remember what I had. James nodded with understanding. Grief makes us do terrible things sometimes, but it doesn't have to define us forever. He looked around the cafe, noting that most patrons had returned to their own conversations, though a few continued to watch their table with curiosity. The question is what you do with this moment. Do you go back to building walls, or do you try something different? Victoria considered his words, feeling the truth of them resonate in her chest. She had built an empire on being untouchable, unreachable, superior to the messy emotions that governed other people's lives. But sitting here, facing the consequences of that isolation, she realized it had cost her more than she'd ever calculated. I don't know how to try something different, she confessed. I've been who I am for so long, I'm not sure there's anything else left underneath. James smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd shown since approaching her table. There's always something else underneath. The trick is being brave enough to look for it. He stood up, preparing to return to Sophie. If you want to try something different, you could start by coming over and meeting my daughter properly. She's always happy to show off her artwork to new friends. The invitation was simple, human, and terrifying in its implications. Victoria could decline, retreat to her safe distance, and continue living the emotionally barricaded life she'd constructed. Or she could take the risk of connection, of allowing herself to feel the pain and joy that came with letting others matter. Victoria rose from her chair on unsteady legs, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor as she followed James to his corner table. Sophie looked up with bright, curious eyes, holding up her completed coloring page with pride. This is my friend Sophie, James said, his voice gentle. Sophie, this is Ms. Victoria. She lost her little girl a while ago, and I thought you might like to show her your beautiful princess. Sophie's face immediately filled with compassion, the kind of pure empathy that only children possess. I'm sorry about your little girl, she said solemnly. Was she nice like you? Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She was the nicest person I ever knew, she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. Just like you seem to be. Sophie beamed and scooted over in her chair, patting the empty space beside her. You can sit here if you want. I have lots of crayons if you want to color too. Daddy says coloring helps when you're sad. Victoria looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself into the small chair beside Sophie, her expensive suit a stark contrast to the child-sized furniture. Sophie immediately began explaining her artistic choices, pointing out details in her princess drawing with infectious enthusiasm. See, I made her dress purple because purple is brave and pretty, and I think princesses should be brave. And I gave her a crown with lots of points because that means she's really important, but also kind to everyone in her kingdom. Victoria found herself leaning in, genuinely interested in Sophie's creative process. That's a beautiful philosophy. What made you think of that? Sophie considered the question seriously. My daddy told me that real princesses are the ones who help other people and make them feel better when they're sad. He says I can be a princess too, even if I don't have a castle. The simple wisdom of the child's words hit Victoria like a physical force. Here was a 7-year-old girl who understood something about leadership and influence that Victoria had forgotten in all her years of corporate climbing. Real power came from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Your daddy sounds very smart, Victoria said, glancing up at James, who was watching the interaction with cautious hope. He is. Sophie agreed matter-of-factly. He knows lots of languages and he can fix computers and he makes the best pancakes in the whole world. And when I have bad dreams about Mommy, he always knows how to make me feel better. Victoria's heart clenched at the casual reference to loss, at the way this little girl had integrated grief into her worldview without letting it destroy her capacity for joy. Tell me about your Mommy, Victoria said gently. Sophie's face lit up. She was from Germany, like the language Daddy sometimes talks to me in. She had pretty yellow hair, and she smelled like flowers, and she always sang to me before bed. Daddy says she's watching over us from heaven, and sometimes I think I can feel her hugging me. Tears rolled freely down Victoria's cheeks now, all pretense of composure abandoned. She was seeing grief through the eyes of a child who had processed loss with the help of a loving parent, rather than the isolation and bitterness that had characterized her own experience. Sophie had kept her heart open despite her pain, while Victoria had locked hers away. She sounds wonderful, Victoria whispered. She was, but she taught me that when someone goes to heaven, the love doesn't go away. It just changes into a different kind of love that helps us love other people better. Sophie reached out and patted Victoria's hand with small, warm fingers. Maybe your little girl is helping you learn to love people better too. The words were so profound, so absolutely perfect, that Victoria couldn't speak for several moments. This child, who had every reason to be bitter about loss and hardship, was offering comfort and wisdom to a woman who had attacked her family an hour earlier. It was a masterclass in grace that put Victoria's years of business school and corporate training to shame. James pulled out a chair and sat down across from them, his expression soft with pride and love as he watched his daughter work her magic on a broken adult. This was Sophie's gift, her ability to see past surfaces to the hurt underneath, to offer healing without judgment or condition. Would you like to color with us? Sophie asked, offering Victoria a fresh page from her coloring book. This one has a queen in it. I think you might like queens better than princesses because you seem like someone who makes important decisions. Victoria accepted the coloring page with hands that shook slightly. I haven't colored since... she began, then stopped. She hadn't colored since Emma died, hadn't allowed herself any activity that might bring back memories of quiet afternoons spent creating art together. It's okay if you forgot how, Sophie said kindly. I can teach you. The most important thing is to have fun and not worry about staying inside the lines. Sometimes the best parts happen when you color outside them. As Victoria selected a crayon and began to carefully outline the Queen's gown, she felt something loosening in her chest, a tightness she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten it wasn't permanent. The simple act of creation, of sitting beside this generous child and participating in innocent joy, was healing something she hadn't even realized was broken. Sophie, she said quietly, thank you for being kind to me, even though I wasn't kind to you and your daddy earlier. Sophie looked up from her own coloring, her expression serious. Daddy says everyone has bad days sometimes, and the best thing we can do is help each other have better ones. Maybe you were just having a bad day. Victoria glanced at James, seeing approval and encouragement in his eyes. I think I've been having a bad day for about 4 years now, she admitted. But this is the first time in a long time that it's felt like it might get better. They colored in companionable silence for a while, the scratch of crayons against paper and the quiet conversations of other cafe patrons creating a peaceful background symphony. Victoria found herself studying Sophie's technique, marveling at the child's fearless approach to color and creativity. There was no hesitation, no self-doubt, just pure expression and joy. My daughter Emma loved to color too, Victoria found herself saying. She always wanted to use every color in the box, even if it didn't make sense. Purple grass, orange sky, rainbow hair. She said normal colors were boring. Sophie's face lit up with recognition and delight. She sounds like me. I love rainbow hair. Look! She pointed to her princess's hair, which was indeed colored in stripes of every hue available. Maybe Emma and I would have been friends if we lived in the same place. I think you would have been best friends, Victoria said, her voice catching. For the first time since Emma's death, talking about her daughter brought more joy than pain, more connection than isolation. She would have loved your brave purple princess dress idea. As they continued coloring, Victoria began to share more memories of Emma, her laugh, her stubborn streak, her fascination with butterflies, and her insistence on wearing her tutu to the grocery store. With each story, the weight in Victoria's chest grew lighter, replaced by something warm and healing she hadn't felt in years. James watched the transformation with wonder and gratitude. This was what Sophie did. She created space for people to be their best selves, to remember what mattered most. Seeing Victoria's icy facade melt away under his daughter's gentle influence felt like witnessing a miracle. You know, Victoria said, looking up from her coloring, I have a foundation that provides art supplies to schools in underserved communities. We've been looking for ways to make our programs more impactful. Maybe I could visit some of these schools myself, actually spend time with the children instead of just writing checks. Sophie clapped her hands together excitedly. That's a wonderful idea. Kids love it when grown-ups want to color with them. It makes them feel important. Victoria smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes for the first time in the conversation. You've taught me something important today, Sophie. Both of you have. She looked at James with genuine gratitude. I want to apologize again, properly this time, not because I got caught, but because I was wrong, about both of you, about what matters, about how I've been living my life. James nodded, accepting the apology with grace. We all make mistakes. The important thing is what we learn from them. I've learned that I've been hiding from life instead of living it, Victoria said quietly. I've been so afraid of feeling pain that I forgot how to feel joy. Watching Sophie, listening to her talk about her mother and about love that changes but never goes away, it reminds me that Emma wouldn't want me to shut out the world. She'd want me to find ways to keep sharing love, even after she's gone. Sophie reached over and squeezed Victoria's hand. I think Emma is happy that you're learning to love people again, and I think she'd like that you're going to help kids with art. Because art makes everyone happy. Victoria squeezed back, marveling at the warmth and acceptance in this child's touch. Would you mind if I came back here sometimes? Maybe we could color together again." "Yes!" Sophie exclaimed. "And maybe next time you could tell me more stories about Emma, and I could tell you more about my mommy. Daddy says sharing good memories makes them stronger." "I would love that," Victoria said, and meant it completely. James checked his watch and reluctantly stood up. "We should get going, sweetheart. Your violin lesson starts in 15 minutes. Sophie carefully gathered her crayons and tore out the page she'd been working on, handing it to Victoria. "This is for you to remember today," she said solemnly. "And to remember that there are lots of people who want to be your friend if you give them a chance." Victoria accepted the drawing with hands that trembled slightly, studying the brave purple princess with her rainbow hair and kind smile. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me," she said truthfully. "I'll treasure it always." As James helped Sophie pack up her art supplies, Victoria stood and smoothed her skirt. But the gesture felt different now, less about maintaining armor and more about preparing to rejoin the world as a different version of herself. "James," she said quietly, "I meant what I said about the foundation. If you're ever interested in consulting work, or if you know of programs that need support, I hope you'll reach out. I think I have a lot to learn about what really makes a difference." James smiled and pulled a business card from his wallet. "I'd like that. And Victoria, thank you for letting Sophie teach you something today. She has a gift for helping people remember what's important." Victoria looked down at the little girl who had changed her entire perspective in the span of an hour. "The gift runs in the family, I think." As James and Sophie headed toward the door, Sophie turned back and waved enthusiastically. "Bye, Victoria. Don't forget to color outside the lines sometimes." Victoria waved back, watching them go with a mixture of sadness and hope. The cafe felt different now, warmer, more welcoming, full of possibilities she hadn't noticed before. She looked down at Sophie's drawing, then at her own half-finished queen, and made a decision. Instead of leaving immediately, Victoria sat back down and picked up her crayon. She began adding unexpected touches to her queen, a rainbow crown, purple shoes, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. For the first time in 4 years, she colored outside the lines intentionally, joyfully, in honor of Emma and in gratitude to a 7-year-old girl who had reminded her how to hope. When she finally stood to leave, Victoria felt like a different person than the one who had walked into Meridian Café that morning. The expensive suit was the same. The heels were just as impractical, but something fundamental had shifted in how she inhabited her own life. She had been reminded that true power came not from the ability to diminish others, but from the courage to let others matter, to let them change you, to let them teach you how to be human again. As she walked past the corner table where James and Sophie had sat, Victoria made a silent promise to Emma and to herself. She would find ways to honor her daughter's memory through connection rather than isolation, through building others up rather than tearing them down. She would remember that everyone she met was fighting battles she knew nothing about, carrying losses and hopes and dreams that made them infinitely more complex than their surface appearances suggested. Outside the cafe, the Seattle morning felt different, brighter, more full of potential. Victoria pulled out her phone and, instead of immediately diving back into work emails, she did something unprecedented. She called her assistant and cleared her schedule for the rest of the morning, then walked to the nearest park and sat on a bench, just watching parents play with their children and remembering what it felt like to believe in the fundamental goodness of human nature. The drawing was still clutched in her hand, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest acts of grace. A coloring book, a kind word, a child's wisdom, a father's courage to demand better. These small things had the power to crack open even the most carefully guarded heart. and let the light back in. Victoria Steinberg had learned something that morning that no MBA program could teach. The true measure of success wasn't in the walls you built or the people you kept out, but in your willingness to be changed by unexpected teachers and to find your way back to the person your loved ones always knew you could be. 3 weeks later, Victoria stood outside the Roosevelt Elementary School in a neighborhood she had never visited before, clutching a box of art supplies and fighting the familiar urge to retreat to her safe, controlled world. The building was older than the schools her foundation typically supported, with faded brick walls and playground equipment that had seen better decades. But inside those walls were children who needed what she could offer, and more importantly, children who could teach her things no boardroom ever could. She had called James the day after their cafe encounter, her voice uncertain as she asked about his consulting offer and his knowledge of local schools. He had listened patiently as she explained her new vision for hands-on involvement, never once reminding her of the cruel assumptions she had made about his own circumstances. His grace in that conversation had been almost as humbling as his daughter's wisdom. Now, as she pushed through the heavy school doors, Victoria felt the same nervous energy she had experienced before her first corporate presentation decades ago. But this time, the stakes felt more personal, more meaningful than any quarterly report or acquisition deal. This time, she was risking something more valuable than money or reputation. She was risking her carefully protected heart. The hallway buzzed with the controlled chaos of an elementary school afternoon. Children's artwork covered every available wall space, their bold colors and uninhibited creativity a stark contrast to the muted sophistication of Victoria's usual environment. She paused in front of a display titled My Family, and found herself studying each drawing with the intensity she once reserved for financial projections. Here was a child's interpretation of love, loss, joy, and belonging, rendered in crayon with an honesty that corporate art could never achieve. Ms. Steinberg? A warm voice broke through her contemplation. Victoria turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching, her smile genuine and welcoming, despite her obviously worn clothes and tired eyes. "I'm Janet Rodriguez, the art teacher. We're so excited you're here today." Victoria shook Janet's hand, noting the paint stains on her fingers and the genuine enthusiasm in her expression. "Thank you for having me. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous. It's been a long time since I've worked directly with children." Janet's smile softened with understanding. The children have a way of making you forget to be nervous. They're just excited that someone wants to create art with them. Many of them don't get that kind of attention at home. As they walked toward the art room, Janet explained the challenges her program faced: limited supplies, overcrowded classes, children who arrived hungry and left to empty homes. Victoria listened with growing amazement at how this teacher continued to provide joy and creative outlet despite obstacles that would have crushed most people. Here was someone who truly understood what mattered, who had dedicated her life to nurturing beauty in unlikely places. "Many of our students come from single-parent homes," Janet continued, unaware of how deeply her words resonated with Victoria's recent experiences. "Some of them are dealing with loss, divorce, financial stress. Art becomes their safe space, their way of processing emotions they might not have words for yet." Victoria thought of Sophie's Purple Princess, of the way that little girl had used creativity to make sense of her mother's absence, while still maintaining faith in goodness and beauty. She began to understand that what she was about to witness wasn't just art class. It was healing in action, resilience being built one crayon stroke at a time. The art room was a riot of color and possibility. 23 third graders sat at paint-splattered tables, their faces bright with anticipation, as Janet introduced their special guest. Victoria felt their curious eyes studying her expensive clothes and perfect hair, and for a moment she wondered if she looked as out of place to them as James had seemed to her in the cafe. "This is Ms. Victoria." Janet announced. "She wanted to come color and paint with you today because she loves art, and she thinks you're all amazing artists." A small boy with serious dark eyes raised his hand. "Are you famous?" he asked, with the directness that only children possess. Victoria considered the question carefully. "Some people know who I am because of my job," she said honestly. "But I'm here because I want to learn from all of you. I think you might be better artists than I am." The children giggled at this possibility, and Victoria felt some of her nervousness begin to dissolve. She took the empty seat Janet indicated, finding herself between a girl with pigtails who was already covered in blue paint and a quiet boy who kept glancing at her with shy curiosity. "What are we creating today?" Victoria asked the girl beside her, whose name tag read Maria. "We're painting our safe places," Maria explained, her brush dripping with cerulean blue. "Mine is my grandmother's kitchen because it always smells like cookies, and she tells me stories about when my mom was little." Victoria's throat tightened unexpectedly. The simple honesty of the child's answer, the way she had immediately identified love and connection as the defining characteristics of safety, reminded Victoria of conversations with Emma about their favorite places in their old house. Emma's bedroom with its butterfly wall decals, the reading nook where they had shared countless stories. "That sounds wonderful," Victoria managed. "Your grandmother sounds very special." "She is?" Maria agreed, adding swirls of yellow to her painting. "What's your safe place?" The question hung in the air as Victoria contemplated her answer. For years, she would have described her office or her penthouse apartment, places where she could control every variable and exclude anything that threatened her emotional equilibrium. But sitting here, surrounded by children who understood instinctively that safety came from love rather than luxury, she realized those places had never been truly safe at all. "I'm still figuring that out," Victoria admitted. "But I think it might be places where people are kind to each other, where they create beautiful things together." Maria nodded approvingly and continued painting, apparently satisfied with this answer. The boy on Victoria's other side, whose name tag identified him as David, had been listening to their conversation while working on his own painting, a detailed rendering of a baseball field complete with tiny figures in the stands. "My safe place is when my dad comes to my games," David said quietly, not looking up from his work. "He works 2 jobs, but he still comes when he can. He always sits in the same spot and waves at me." Victoria studied David's painting with new eyes, seeing the love and longing embedded in every careful brushstroke. This was a child who understood that presence was more valuable than presence, that showing up mattered more than material comfort. She thought of James, working as both mother and father to Sophie, while dealing with his own grief, still finding ways to make his daughter feel loved and valued. "Your dad sounds like a hero," Victoria said softly. David finally looked up at her, his young face serious. "He says regular people can be heroes too, if they take care of the people they love." The wisdom of children continued to astound Victoria. Here was another profound truth delivered without pretension or agenda. Heroism wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition, but about the daily choice to show up for the people who mattered most. As the afternoon progressed, Victoria found herself drawn into conversation after conversation with children who had experienced more hardship than many adults she knew, yet who approached life with an optimism and creativity that put her years of cynicism to shame. There was 8-year-old Carmen, whose father had been deported, but who painted rainbows because sad colors don't help anybody feel better. There was Marcus, living with his grandmother since his mother's death, who created elaborate fantasy worlds where families never had to say goodbye. Each child's story chipped away at Victoria's remaining emotional armor, revealing the hollow inadequacy of the life she had constructed in the wake of Emma's death. These children faced daily challenges that dwarfed most corporate crises, Yet they continued to create, to hope, to find beauty in unexpected places. They had learned what Victoria had forgotten. That vulnerability wasn't weakness, but the foundation of genuine strength. When it came time for Victoria to create her own painting, she found herself staring at the blank canvas with the same paralysis she had felt at the cafe. What was her safe place? What images would capture the complex truth of who she was becoming rather than who she had been? Sometimes it helps to close your eyes and think about when you felt the happiest, suggested a girl named Isabella, whose own painting featured a house surrounded by sunflowers. Then you paint that feeling. Victoria closed her eyes and let her mind wander. Past the corporate achievements, past the financial milestones, past the carefully constructed public persona. She found herself remembering Emma at 3 years old, sitting in their garden and insisting on planting flowers in completely random patterns because nature doesn't care about staying in lines, Mama. When Victoria opened her eyes, her hand seemed to move without conscious direction. She painted a garden, not the perfectly manicured landscape of her current home, but a wild, joyful explosion of colors where every flower was different, where chaos and beauty coexisted in perfect harmony. In the center, she added a small figure with curly hair and a rainbow dress, arms stretched wide as if embracing the entire world. "That's beautiful," Maria said, peering over Victoria's shoulder. "Is that your little girl?" Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. "Her name was Emma. She died when she was very small, but she taught me that the best art happens when you're not afraid to make mistakes." "Like coloring outside the lines?" David asked, remembering their earlier conversation about safe places. "Exactly like that," Victoria confirmed, smiling through tears that felt healing rather than painful. She would have loved meeting all of you. She would have wanted to paint flowers and rainbows and stories about brave princesses. As the class period drew to a close, Janet asked each child to share something about their painting with the group. Victoria listened with growing amazement as each young artist explained their creative choices with the same seriousness and insight she had once reserved for business presentations. These children understood instinctively what she had spent years forgetting, that art wasn't about perfection, but about truth, not about impressing others, but about expressing the authentic self. When it was Victoria's turn to share, she stood before the class holding her painting with hands that no longer trembled with nervousness, but with anticipation. "I painted a memory of my daughter, Emma, and the garden we planted together. She taught me that some of the most beautiful things happen when we stop trying to control everything and just let love grow wherever it wants to." The children applauded with the same enthusiasm they had shown for their classmates, accepting Victoria's story as naturally as they had shared their own. In their eyes, she wasn't a CEO or a billionaire or someone to be intimidated by. She was simply another person learning to make sense of the world through color and creativity. After the students had cleaned up and been dismissed, Victoria remained in the classroom, helping Janet organize supplies and process the afternoon's experiences. The teacher had watched Victoria's transformation throughout the session with the knowing eyes of someone who had seen art work its magic countless times before. "You're a natural at this," Janet said, stacking painted canvases to dry. "The children responded to you immediately. They could sense your sincerity." Victoria looked around the room, taking in the cheerful chaos of a space dedicated to nurturing creativity. "I had forgotten what it felt like to create something just for the joy of it, without worrying about outcomes or judgments. These children reminded me of parts of myself I thought were lost forever." Janet smiled, recognizing the signs of someone whose life had been changed by unexpected teachers. "They have that effect on people. Children see straight through to what matters most. They don't care about your bank account or your job title. They just want to know if you're going to be kind, if you're going to pay attention to what they have to show you." As Victoria prepared to leave, Several children ran up to her with their paintings, eager to give her their artwork as gifts. Maria pressed her blue and yellow safe place painting into Victoria's hands. "This is for you to remember that grandmother's kitchens are always good safe places, even if you don't have a grandmother anymore." David offered his baseball field painting with characteristic shyness. "My dad says sharing good things makes them bigger. Maybe you can share this with someone who needs to remember about heroes." By the time Victoria reached her car, she was carrying an armload of original artwork and a heart fuller than it had been in years. Each painting represented not just a child's creative expression, but a lesson in resilience, hope, and the power of human connection. These children had given her glimpses into their worlds with the same generosity Sophie had shown in the cafe, trusting her with their stories and their dreams. Driving home through Seattle traffic, Victoria found herself seeing the city differently. Instead of focusing on the luxury apartments and high-end shopping districts she usually frequented, she noticed the schools and community centers, the parks where families gathered, the small businesses that served as gathering places for neighborhoods. She began to understand that the real life of the city happened not in boardrooms and exclusive restaurants, but in these everyday spaces where people took care of each other and found ways to create beauty amid ordinary struggles. That evening, Victoria did something she hadn't done since Emma's death. She called her sister Rebecca, whom she had gradually pushed away as grief made social connections feel too painful to maintain. Rebecca answered on the second ring, her voice carrying surprise and cautious hope. "Victoria, is everything okay?" "I'm okay," Victoria said, and realized she meant it more than she had in years. "Actually, I'm better than I've been in a long time. I wanted to tell you about something that happened today, about some children who taught me things I didn't know I needed to learn." They talked for over an hour, Victoria sharing stories from both the cafe encounter and the school visit, while Rebecca listened with growing amazement at the changes in her sister's voice and perspective. For the first time since Emma's funeral, Victoria allowed herself to be vulnerable with someone who loved her, to admit to the loneliness and fear that had driven her to build such high walls around her heart. "I've missed you," Rebecca said quietly. "I've missed the sister who used to believe that people were fundamentally good, who wanted to change the world instead of just profit from it. I've missed her too," Victoria admitted. "But I think maybe she's still in here somewhere, just buried under layers of protection that stopped protecting and started imprisoning. Today reminded me that some risks are worth taking, that some kinds of vulnerability make you stronger rather than weaker." They made plans to have dinner the following week, a simple commitment that felt momentous to Victoria. She was beginning to understand that healing happened not through grand gestures, but through small acts of courage, reaching out to an estranged sister, sitting with children in an art classroom, admitting to a stranger in a cafe that you had been wrong about everything that mattered. Over the following weeks, Victoria established a routine that would have been unthinkable to her former self. Every Tuesday afternoon, she visited Roosevelt Elementary to participate in art class. She learned the names and stories of all 23 students, celebrating their successes and offering comfort during their struggles. She funded new supplies and equipment, but insisted on being involved in their distribution, wanting to see firsthand how her resources translated into expanded opportunities for creative expression. The children embraced her presence with the uncomplicated acceptance that was their gift. They shared their lunches when she forgot to eat, included her in playground games despite her impractical shoes, and gradually taught her to see the world through eyes unclouded by cynicism or fear. Each Tuesday became a masterclass in what really mattered, delivered by teachers who measured success in laughter shared and kindness given rather than profits earned or competitors defeated. James and Sophie had become regular fixtures in Victoria's life as well. Their cafe encounters evolved into weekend visits to museums and parks, opportunities for Victoria to practice the art of friendship she had nearly forgotten how to cultivate. Sophie continued to amaze Victoria with her wisdom and resilience, while James offered the patient guidance of someone who understood the long journey from grief to gratitude. "You're different now," Sophie observed during one of their museum visits, studying Victoria with the penetrating gaze that made her such an effective teacher of adult hearts. "You smile more with your eyes, not just your mouth." Victoria knelt down to Sophie's level, meeting her gaze directly. "You and your daddy taught me how to do that. You showed me that real smiles come from letting people matter to you, even when that feels scary." Sophie nodded solemnly, as if this observation confirmed something she had suspected all along. "My mommy used to say that scared feelings are just love trying to keep you safe, but sometimes love is braver when you let it out instead of keeping it inside." Once again, Victoria found herself awed by the depth of understanding contained in this small person. Sophie had learned to articulate truths about love and courage that many adults spent entire lifetimes trying to grasp. Her mother's wisdom, filtered through James's patient nurturing, had created a child who could heal wounded hearts with the same natural ease other children showed in playground games. The transformation wasn't instant or complete. Grief and defensive habits don't disappear overnight. But Victoria felt herself becoming someone she could respect again, someone Emma would have been proud to call mother. She began restructuring her business practices to align with her evolving values, implementing programs that prioritized employee well-being alongside profit margins, establishing partnerships with organizations that supported struggling families rather than simply maximizing shareholder returns. Her board of directors initially resisted these changes, viewing them as sentimental weakness that would compromise their competitive edge. But Victoria's new approach began generating the kind of positive publicity and employee loyalty that translated into sustainable success. Workers who felt valued and supported became more creative and productive. Customers responded positively to a company that demonstrated genuine care for community welfare. The business thrived, even as it evolved to embody principles beyond pure capitalism. 6 months after that pivotal morning in Meridian Café, Victoria stood before a packed auditorium delivering a keynote address to a conference of business leaders. But instead of discussing market strategies or acquisition targets, she spoke about the lessons she had learned from a 7-year-old girl and her father, about the children at Roosevelt Elementary, who had taught her that true success was measured not in dollars accumulated, but in lives touched, not in competitors defeated, but in communities strengthened. "I spent years believing that power meant the ability to control outcomes, to insulate myself from uncertainty and pain," she told the audience of executives and entrepreneurs. "But real power, the kind that actually changes the world, comes from the courage to be changed by it. It comes from admitting when you've been wrong, from letting unlikely teachers show you better ways to live, from choosing connection over protection, even when that choice makes you vulnerable." The response was mixed. Some attendees dismissed her message as naive idealism, while others approached her afterward to share their own stories of transformation and redemption. Victoria realized she no longer needed universal approval or understanding. She had learned to derive satisfaction from living according to her values rather than from managing others' perceptions of her success. After the conference, Victoria drove directly to Roosevelt Elementary for her regular Tuesday afternoon art session. The familiar chaos of children's voices and the smell of tempera paint welcomed her like an embrace. These weekly visits had become her anchor, the place where she remembered who she was choosing to become rather than who she had been. "Ms. Victoria!" Maria called out, running to hug her legs with paint-covered hands. "Wait until you see what I painted today. It's a picture of all my safe places together. My grandmother's kitchen and our classroom and the park where my dad pushes me on the swings." Victoria admired Maria's latest creation, marveling at how this 8-year-old had intuitively understood something it had taken Victoria decades to learn, that safety wasn't a single location, but a network of relationships, a collection of moments when love made itself visible through attention and care. As she settled into her seat between familiar young artists, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this paint-splattered table. 6 months ago, she had been a woman so armored against pain that she could only see the world in terms of threats to be neutralized or advantages to be exploited. Now she was someone who looked forward to Tuesday afternoons with the same anticipation she had once reserved for major business deals, someone who measured her days by the smiles earned and the hearts opened rather than the profits generated. The transformation hadn't erased her grief over Emma's death. That loss would always be part of her story, but grief no longer defined the entire narrative. Instead, it had become one thread in a richer tapestry that included unexpected friendships, renewed family connections, and the daily joy of watching children discover their own creative power. Emma's memory lived not in the walls Victoria had built around her heart, but in the bridges she was now brave enough to build toward others. "What are you painting today, Miss Victoria?" asked David, whose own artistic skills had flourished under Victoria's encouragement and Janet's expert guidance. Victoria looked at her blank canvas and smiled, no longer paralyzed by the infinite possibilities it represented. "I think I'm going to paint a story," she said, picking up her brush with the confidence of someone who had learned that the most beautiful art emerged not from perfection, but from the willingness to begin again, to color outside the lines, to trust that mistakes could become masterpieces in the hands of patient love. The afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows, illuminating the faces of children who had become her teachers, transforming an ordinary Tuesday into another opportunity to practice the art of being fully, courageously human. Victoria began to paint, adding her voice to the symphony of creativity that filled the room, grateful beyond measure for the unexpected grace that had brought her home to herself through the wisdom of a child, the courage of a grieving father, and the endless possibility of second chances freely given and humbly received.